Hello everybody, Vorgéad fáilte chuig webinar an lei inmh. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. A big and warm welcome to you all for today's webinar, the third in the series of In Conversation With, a series of webinars to promote public and professional conversation, informed debate and engagement with educational policy and leadership. Today, I'm very grateful to be joined by Professor James Spillane, whose presentation will focus on the Policy Implementation Challenge, Educational Infrastructure and Change at Scale. Jim is Professor in Learning and Organisational Change at the School of Education and Social Policy, Northwestern University. From Ireland and a primary school teacher, Jim has published extensively on issues of educational policy, policy implementation, school reform and organisational leadership. His work explores the policy implementation process at many levels, focusing on intergovernmental and policy practice relations. And recent projects include studies connected to the topic of his presentation today and the socialisation of new school principles. Jim has consulted widely with government and non-government agencies in the US and around the world. Jim, Céad Míle Fáilte, you're very welcome, and it's over to you.
Good evening, Gavin. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Good evening, I guess, to everybody. It's still morning here in South Florida, so we'll get used to these time differences. I want to talk today about a challenge that has been around for, or at least documented by researchers for a good 50 years, and that's the challenge of implementing policy, education policy in particular. And I want to focus on a particular class of our category of policies, and those are policies that are intended to improve the quality of instruction or teaching and learning, and something that has become increasingly important over the last decade or so, addressing inequities in children's opportunities to learn. And I think it's very important that we keep the sort of policies that I'm going to talk about, that's about teaching, in mind, because there's a whole variety of education policies that address everything from who can teach to school safety, etc. But I'm really talking about policies that are all about core work of schooling, which is teaching. And over the past several decades, this is especially true in the US, but I think also around the world, policymakers have developed an appetite for promoting what people refer to as ambitious teaching and learning, intellectually rigorous teaching and learning. And it goes by a lot of ideas, but I think at its core, there are three ideas. One is that children from a young age can learn not only procedural knowledge, but also principled knowledge. And secondly, that children should engage in what people refer to as authentic disciplinary processes. In other words, when they read text, they should learn to critique text. When they do mathematics, they should learn about mathematics as a process, as a language, as a way of engaging in the world. And the same goes for science and other school subjects. And third, that this work is for all kids. It's not just for the few, the academically most able, white, privileged, upper class kids. It's for everybody. Now, enacting these ideas, these ideals, if you will, in classroom practice is going to require a change in the academic tasks that teachers engage students with, as well as a change in the discourse. In other words, how teachers talk to kids, how kids talk to one another about the subject matter that they're studying. So these are the ideas that have actually consumed me for the last 25 or 30 years, trying to understand the challenges involved in implementing these very ambitious ideas about teaching and learning in classrooms. And the literature really talks to the implementation challenge. We talk about the spread of policy ideas. We talk about, ideas can spread, but they may not stick. They may, people may try them out for a year and then that's it. And also, of course, there's the whole issue of, this is the word I use is soul, the extent to which the implementation really speaks to the essence of the ideas advanced by policy. Part of the challenge here, by the way, is the fact that very often policymakers have not worked the ideas out fully. In fact, one of the things that has happened over the past 30 or 40 years has been huge advancement in research on teaching and the practice of teaching. So in many respects, there's this back and forth between policy, research, and indeed practice. The literature is really a lament. We have 40, 50 years of stories about implementation failure. And often the explanation has to do with the fact that teachers, school leaders, local education leaders do not want to change. Change involves risk, change involves uncertainty. We all love certainty. What I want to do today is to really look at an alternative way of looking at why policy fails, not because teachers, school leaders are necessarily resistant to change or don't want to engage with new ideas. One instead that I argue is a sense-making perspective. I then want to argue that introduce the notion of educational infrastructure and argue really that the implementation challenge has to be seen as a system challenge. And in particular, it has to do with designing educational infrastructures that support implementation. And I would argue actually innovation and ongoing professional learning in school systems. And I'm going to, if time permits, tell you a little story about a school system in the United States, in Nebraska, that we've been studying, we have studied for 6 or 7 years as an example of what I mean by educational infrastructure building and how it supports implementation. Gavin, if I should watch my time, but do interrupt me if I go too long. The sense-making framework really challenges the implementation literature, which basically assumed that the people who were charged with implementing policy, teachers, school leaders, that they understood what it was policymakers were asking them to do differently. And over the past 20 years, several scholars, myself included, have challenged that idea and argued that implementation often fails because people misunderstand what it is that policy is asking them to do differently. There are various words or titles used to describe this tradition, but an interpretive approach to policy implementation. People have focused on policy as learning. I actually like to frame it all in terms of a sense-making perspective, which basically argues that you can think about policy as text, and that texts have to be interpreted and understood. But from a sense-making perspective, it is not just the interpretation that matters. Interpretation is just part of sense-making. But basically, sense-making is also about what is it that people notice in their environment? Do they notice the policy? In some of my earlier work, for example, when I interviewed teachers about responding to policy, they often focused entirely on just the assessments that the students were given, not on the curriculum necessarily. In other words, their understandings were the cue that they focused on was student assessments. So a sense-making perspective is about noticing, it's about bracketing particular cues, and then it's about interpretation. And a big finding from this work is that that understanding tends to be a conserving process, favoring existing understandings over new ideas. Indeed, often one of the things we notice is that cognitive scientists tell us when people encounter new information, they use analogies to their existing understandings. One of the things we noticed is that people tend to draw analogies to surface features of reform or policy ideas rather than to the underlying structural ideas. So in some of the work that I did back in the 90s, last century, one of the things we noticed is that when teachers heard about mathematics as problem solving, they tended to think about giving kids story problems, which of course is a very a very surface feature of the reform ideas, and not going to the underlying idea, which is that mathematics as a discipline is about problem solving. It's a central process to the work. One of the downsides of that work is that it suggests that people who have rich understandings about subject matter, about teaching, will implement the reform. People who do not will tend to implement it at a very surface level. However, one of the findings from the work is that sense making is situated, and people, actually teachers, school leaders, make sense of reform, make sense of their environments, often in interaction with one another. It's a collective or social process. And that the situation in which they make sense, I'm not going to focus on Stephen Ball's policy texts and discourses, or the notion of policy technologies, which is a very important idea. I want to focus on the last bullet here, which is that people make sense in organizations such as schools, school systems, and indeed beyond the formal organization to professional networks and the likes. And one of the things that we found from this work is, of course, that some teachers work in situations that encourage and engage them in making sense of policy in ways that help them learn and develop new understandings. Others work in situations where that's not the case. And from this, we take some, actually, it's a cause for optimism, because we can indeed change the organizational circumstances, both at the school and the system level, in which teachers engage with, encounter policy, reform, innovation, etc. This brings me to the second big idea I want to put forward here. This is from more recent work. And basically, and again, this is based on work I've done in the US, but basically, one of the things we have observed in the US over the past 20 years, over the first 2 decades of this century, has been what we call education system building. And I'm not going to go a lot into it, but basically a lot of US school systems, school districts, to those of you who are familiar with the US, or charter school networks, or there are various private systems, that these school systems have been engaged in trying to transform themselves from school systems into education systems. And central to this work has been building an educational infrastructure at the system level that, of course, operates at multiple levels within the system to support the work of teaching. And basically our understanding of this is that it refers to the structures and resources that educational systems, together with their schools, mobilize to support teaching, to maintain the quality of teaching, and indeed, very relevant to our conversation today, to lead improvement in teaching. And this includes everything from the curriculum that teachers use in their classroom, the texts they use, the student assessments, but it also goes beyond that to the formal positions, principal, teacher, leader, coach, the routines, the procedures. And just for fear people think I'm being very material here, I'm not actually. It also includes a set of norms, a set of values, and a set of cognitive scripts that infuse the work. And of course, it includes rules and regulations about the work. I want to draw attention to this because often when we hear the word infrastructure, we think of physical infrastructure, and that is in many respects for a starting point for people who have become interested in the role of infrastructure. Another motivation, by the way, is work in sociology that has focused on the role of structure and agency and the relationship between the two, such as these are not polar opposites. In fact, I can't think of her name right now, but I can see the book. The argument actually from a British sociologist that there is no agency without structure. And this has been some of the theoretical motivation for our work here. This is just a representation. One of the things about infrastructure, by the way, is that it's hidden. We don't notice it. We only notice it when something goes wrong. And part of what we're trying to represent here, we don't, every morning we enter school or we work in the ministry, we don't think about the norms, the values, the protocols, the procedures, the routines that fundamentally shape how we work with one another. And that has, I'm going to tell you a quick little story. I want you to come with me to Nebraska. This is a study funded by the National Science Foundation. We finished up about 4 years ago. And there's a lot written about it, so you don't have to rely on what I say today. I'm going to talk about one of the three school systems in which we conducted this research. And basically, I'm not going to go into the methodology. It's a mixed method longitudinal design involving teacher surveys, administrative records, including student achievement, but also interviews with a purposeful sample of school, with teachers, school leaders, system leaders, in a purposeful sample of 5 of the 14 elementary schools. We surveyed all 14. And basically, this is one of those situations where we were studying the role of teacher leaders, and all of a sudden, we saw this opportunity to look at really the effort of one of these school systems to fundamentally change their educational infrastructure around elementary or primary school mathematics. And they adopted a new curriculum, Investigations. And Investigations, if you don't know anything about it, is a curriculum that really balances principled and procedural knowledge in mathematics. It's not good enough to learn how to add, subtract, divide, multiply. That's very important, but you also need to understand the mathematical principles that are fundamental to these procedures, and kids explore those in various ways. But the system not only adopted a curriculum, it also created a very intense professional development program for teacher leaders. These teacher leaders were strategically selected by system leaders and school principals. It created a teacher leader or a coach position, depending on the school, for mathematics. And it involved the creation of new routines, such as professional learning communities at each grade level, or the repurposing of existing routines, such as grade level team meetings and the likes. And these routines, by the way, operated at multiple levels within the system. There were some were system level, there were some at the school level, some at the grade level, and that's an important part of the story. So this gives you a sense of what I mean by infrastructure, but the reason I pull it out as a case, and the reason we've written extensively about it, is that over the 4 or 5 years that we had data on, we show a remarkable shift in teachers' beliefs about teaching mathematics across time. Paper comes up next, so you can read the details and the methods all you want. Basically, we use growth models. And then one of the key findings from this is that what was critical were teachers' interactions with peers. Who did you, if you interacted with somebody this year who had more inquiry-oriented beliefs about teaching math, you became and reported more inquiry-oriented beliefs the next year on the scales that we used. So I bring this to your attention because what we do in this work is we unpack how this success story, not all teachers, by the way, changed their beliefs. Some teachers became 60% of the teachers developed more inquiry-oriented beliefs. I think it was 30% developed less inquiry-oriented beliefs, and 10% stayed the same. But on average, there was a significant shift in beliefs towards more inquiry-oriented beliefs. And through the process of analyzing the data, quantitative and qualitative, listening to teachers' rich and school leaders' rich accounts, we developed, and using communities of practice framework, our argument goes something like this. Basically, one way to think about a school system is that it's made up of a variety of communities of practice, such as teachers and students, coaches and teacher leaders, principals and other school leaders, and system leaders. We could add a lot of others in here, such as parents, etc. And one of the things that we argue based on our analysis of the data is that the infrastructure fundamentally shaped the interactions among these communities of practice. And it did so by creating what we refer to as boundary practices. These were practices, actually they were mostly routines that the system had put in place that brought together people from different communities of practice in the system. And they brought these people together. The interactions among them were supported by boundary spanners, such, for example, as the math teacher leaders and the coaches, but also a variety of others. And especially important, boundary objects, such as the new curriculum, such as students' work. For example, they created new assessments that reflected the new curriculum, and the teachers worked together to grade these. These became objects around which, are artifacts, if you prefer, around which teachers negotiated. What does this new policy, this new curriculum mean for my teaching of math? Why am I asking kids for what are the different ways in which they approach the problem? If they have one answer, isn't that enough? And I'm not going to share a lot of the data with you, but teachers reported, a lot of teachers reported being skeptical initially. Some reported still having reservations, but they also reported how their understanding of these new ideas about teaching mathematics, and indeed their understanding of mathematics itself as a subject, changed as a result of these interactions across time. Just so you have a little sense here, the quantitative data, I'm just giving you one example of a coach. Before this person was selected to go through the professional development, was a third grade teacher. Here we see a year later, having completed what was really a master's in mathematics, education and mathematics. And here, another year on, we show a fundamental shift in the interaction patterns in this school. In fact, actually, if you look across all 14 schools, we see a dramatic increase in interaction patterns about mathematics. We just don't ask people, who do you talk to? We ask them, who do you talk to about a variety of different subjects? The one thing I want to really stress here is that when I first presented on this work, people wanted to interpret it as, oh, this is about coaching, the importance of coaching. And I said, no, no, no. Coaching is only part of this. What's critical about educational infrastructure is thinking about all the components. Coaching is one. Teacher leaders is another component. But so is curriculum. So are the routines. And the challenge, if you will, is building these infrastructures so they work together in interaction with one another, rather than thinking about coaching as the solution or teacher leaders as the solution or a new curriculum as the solution. We need to think about what are the components that make up infrastructure and how do they work together or not, as often happens, in supporting teaching and supporting the implementation of new ideas. So a few lessons, and I'm going to stop. Designing educational infrastructure to support policy implementation. The key things, I think, are the work has to be anchored in some taken a shared vision for instruction. If everybody has different visions, if a large proportion of people in the system just think that teachers just think that students, children, pupils should only learn about procedures in primary school mathematics, you got a problem. So developing a shared vision is important. The educational infrastructure has to be designed in a way that not only engages teachers, school leaders, system leaders with the official curriculum, but also with the enacted curriculum, and bring these into conversations with one another. When we go about promoting new policies, we often just focus on these ideal visions of what this new teaching is all about, rather than also saying, well, where are we right now? And that may vary depending on the teacher, depending on the school. So an infrastructure that attends to both the official and the enacted. It has to allow for the building of shared knowledge about instruction among people. And actually, one of the things that was really striking about Auburn Park, the system I just told you about, is that the direction of communication about the implementation of the new curriculum went both ways. Yes, there was ideas coming from system leaders through the various boundary spanners, but these boundary spanners also took ideas back and said, you know, teachers are having a problem with this. They don't think it's working. What can we do about that? How can we support them in their efforts to implement? It has to cultivate trust and interaction among staff and stakeholders. It has to allow for some experimentation and innovation. There has to be some ongoing evaluation that is then used to support improvement efforts. And it's not good enough just to build an infrastructure and deploy it, if you will. We also have to work to support that infrastructure in practice. And principals in these 14 schools talked extensively about supporting infrastructure and use, supporting, for example, the professional learning community's routine that happened weekly at every grade level. They had to work hard at that, but absent that, they were pretty sure that it would not have worked. I'm going to end, basically I've said all of this, thinking about how the components of infrastructure interact in practice, thinking across multiple levels, classroom, grade, or second class, third class, school system, attention not only to the regulations, if you will, but also to the norms and the cultural cognitive dimension of infrastructure. And in all of this, leadership, of course, is critical, not only in the design and deployment of these infrastructures, but also supporting it in use. The challenge with infrastructure, this is one of my favorite buildings in the Marais in Paris. The challenge with infrastructure is that typically, with the exception of the Pompidou in the Marais, is that infrastructure is hidden from us. We don't, as I said at the outset, we don't attend to its various components and how it's working unless something is wrong. So unfortunately, a key challenge is beginning to do some diagnostic work around infrastructure. I'm going to stop here. I know that Gavin has some questions and that you have some questions. I should say that one of the exciting things of the past year has been working with the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, Patrick Sullivan in particular, and several other advisors on thinking about the new primary school framework and the work of rolling that out over the years to come, which has really been using a lot of these ideas. Thank you, Gavin.
Jim, thank you very, very much for that really detailed, comprehensive presentation on so many issues that affect our daily life, certainly in the education system in Ireland. I have about 4 questions, and just a shout out again to everybody in the audience to use the chat function or the Q&A function, whichever is easiest for you, and I'll keep an eye on those, and when we get through these questions, we'll turn it out to the audience. Jim, you set out a very clear understanding of your interpretation of policy, policy making, the official nature of it, the enacted. I'm just wondering, how is an understanding of policy important for or beneficial to school principals, school leaders?
Well, you know, it's Gavin, it's really impossible, I think, for any principal or school leader to do their job without having coming up against policy. And by the way, there are a lot of people that are hypercritical of policy, and I have been critical of certain policies. But I think policy also has done a lot of good. In the United States, policies on desegregation of schools, for example, policies on school finance have made huge improvements, at least initially, on some key issues. But policy is everywhere. We can't work without it. And I think what's important is, therefore, and you often may not actually, one of the things that happens with policy very often is that you hear about it secondhand. In other words, it's not the actual policy or the circular or the actual curriculum is, it's people make sense of it and then they give sense to others. So it may be an account of somebody else. So I think policy is a fundamental part of working in schools and school systems. It's always going to be like that. And I think what's important for school leaders is to think about what's my role vis-a-vis this policy. And today I focused on the implementation. I would argue that one part of your role is working with teachers, cultivating the conditions that support taking a shared understanding of what does this mean, and equally important, what are the entailments of this for our everyday teaching practice. Those things are often not spelled out in policy because policymakers themselves are figuring it out, or there's an effort to give agency to teachers, to school leaders in filling out what actually these ideas might actually mean in the day-to-day teaching of mathematics or teaching of reading or teaching of writing in 5th class or 6th class or whatever. So I think thinking of policy as kind of some prescription or a recipe, here's what we have to do, is not the way to think about it. Thinking of it instead as something around which we being school leaders and teachers, together can figure out, can negotiate how best to teach kids about why we count the number of decimal places to the right of the decimal point when we multiply decimals, right? Why do we do that? Well, how would we teach kids to understand place value? Those are the, so policy is really an opportunity, I think, to think about how we teach, how kids learn, and how we might improve that. Now, having said that, there are policies that, you know, say, you shall not do this, right? You'll drive at the speed limit. Those are very different sort of policies. They're not the ones that I'm looking at today. But they too are part and parcel of the work of a school leader.
Yeah, sure. And I guess there's a role there, isn't there, for school principals, especially to work with teachers in their school community to aid that sense making you talk about, and perhaps to work to mitigate that perception that can often exist. This is a policy text, we must do it unquestioningly, and can promote that agency, I suppose.
Yes, I think you're very, very right. But I would also argue, Gavin, I think that for too long, at least in the US, we have, system leaders, in particular policymakers, make policy and they say, here you go, figure it out. I'm arguing in the US that when we think about leadership, we cannot just focus on the school. We have to also build infrastructures that help school leaders work with teachers. And unfortunately, too often, at least in the US, I think Ireland is in a different place. We're not doing that at the system level. I mean, they're struggling to do it, but they're struggling to do it in situations that are pretty difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose what we've talked about so far is this nature of policy, a little bit of make and do, if you like. And part of that doing is all about implementation. And that can be really challenging, I suppose. So I'm just wondering, what needs to be on the radars of those in the system, as you say, as well as those in the school, namely probably the principal, in order to get implementation right? Or is thinking of it, as being right or wrong, perhaps not helpful even?
Yeah, sorry, just somebody noticed I talk about implementation. Actually, I've used the term enactment also, and zones of enactment is a term that I coined a long time ago. So, and I do think the word enactment or the construct of enactment has some affordances that implementation does not, because in some respects, implementation assumes something that you follow and do, whereas enactment actually, I think, also allows room for constructing the very ideas themselves. I actually think, we work in education. We work in a sector where what we're all about is teaching and learning. And we know a lot about that. So what I would say to school leaders is think about this challenge as one of cultivating the conditions that support teachers and school leaders learning together about what this policy means and what it means for our work as teachers in classrooms. And the fact that we all have backgrounds in teaching and learning, and we've studied a lot about it, helps. But it's very important to keep in mind that adult learners are not the same as children and adolescents. But we actually have learned a lot over the last 50 years about adults as learners. And, it just always surprised me that, you'd hear child development, adolescent development, and then adult development, as if at 18 or 19, there was this phase that spanned 50 or 60 years. But actually, there are some of my colleagues who study adult development and adult learning. There are stages that people go through. So I think thinking about the teachers, the staff, indeed even parents as learners, and how do we cultivate learning about what we should be doing in our classrooms. I think also what's very important here is that this is not purely cognitive. We know this when we talk about kids. We know the importance of the affective when we think about children in a classroom. The same goes for adults. When we encounter new ideas about teaching mathematics or teaching reading, we're often say, hang on a second, I don't like the uncertainty that comes with that. It scares me. We need to, I think, when we think about learning, when we think about creating a community of learners, if you will, in schools or grade levels or even across schools, we need to think about the cognitive, the motivational, the affective, and of course, the behavioral. But I think too often, we focus on the behavior and the cognitive without attending to the affective. And for example, there is evidence to suggest that when teachers do feel this uncertainty about change, imagine you've been teaching mathematics the same way for 20 years and all of a sudden you're told, well, I don't think that was so good. that's a really, really difficult moment for anybody. So when teachers have support from one another, from leaders, there's a sense of security that allows them to manage the uncertainty better.
Yeah, and I suppose there are certain practices too that almost trigger this more intense emotional response, such as kind of erring on the side more of the evaluative rather than really focusing on an infrastructure, let's say, that promotes the developmental.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that is unfortunate in the U.S. is that the standards movement, the efforts to promote ambitious, rigorous learning standards, came with an accountability movement that was really not well thought through. That put a lot of fear into not only teachers but school leaders and indeed kids and system leaders. I mean, there's been huge stories of cheating. So I think that's unfortunate. We are actually at the moment looking at the efforts to roll out next generation science standards in primary schools. And science is different from English and math because it was spared the high stakes accountability. And it's very, we're in the early stages, but it's very interesting to contrast science with the other two subjects because it's more of a movement really than people feeling, oh, we have to do this. But anyway, that's a whole other story, I think.
Well, I think that movement probably does resonate with being at its core, aiming to try and impact teaching and learning or the instructional core that happens in classrooms, but maybe brings people away from that. And in your presentation, you drew a lot on the idea of the educational infrastructure. So I'm just wondering, how do we get that infrastructure in good shape so that it does get to that instructional core rather than, you know, a frenzy of other activities that almost neglect teaching and learning through accountability and so on?
Yeah, I think that, and again, I think Ireland may be better positioned to do this than the US, in the sense that you do have a history of collaborative, at least at the national level, of the various stakeholders coming together to design, change curriculum, etc. And I think that's a very different starting ground than in the US, where you know, the system is so fragmented. First of all, there are thousands of school systems. I mean, the notion that there's a United States school system is just silly. The notion that there's an Illinois or a Florida school system is just doesn't make any sense. They're local. And some of them, like New York, enrolls more students than the whole Irish K-12 school system. But that fragmentation, I think, has created real problems in the US. For me, I always like to start with the classroom, teaching. And this is an idea that the late Richard Elmore coined a long time ago when he talked about backward mapping. And it's not perfect as a tool, so don't use it literally. But if you ask yourself, what would need to happen in this classroom to enact the ideals set forth for example, the new literacy, let's say in second class, and then work backwards through the system and how could the system support teachers, students, enacting, figuring out how to enact these, figuring out what the ideas are, figuring out how to enact them. And you'd work from the class level, the classroom, the grade level, the school. I also think it's important because Ireland has a lot of small schools where you have one or two teachers. I think it's important, and we thought we could never do a lot of this. We had to do it in person. We couldn't do it virtually, but COVID taught us otherwise. I think creating networks of schools so that they have opportunities to work together. If you teach, all grades or half the grades in a school, you need colleagues who are struggling with similar challenges, and that's one of the things from the Auburn Park case that's powerful is that in their efforts to enact the curriculum, they came up against challenges. They were coming up against similar challenges, or they tried to enact it in a particular way and they were sharing this with colleagues. I'm not sure that's what the curriculum developers intended. I'm not sure those are the sorts of opportunities we need to cultivate. Part of it is, I think, changing the school day so there's time for teachers to work together. And there's a lot of evidence of this from places like Japan, lesson study, etc., where there is time for teachers to work as professionals on teaching, not on extracurricular stuff. They can do that, I don't care. Not on filling out administrative forms. Time built into the day where they can work together about teaching, about its improvement. Now, one caveat on this is that it's not going to work unless there is support for these routines in practice. In other words, teachers can get together and not talk about teaching, or they can get together and spend their time, arguing about, well, I can't do this, it's the kids, right? We need to create supports that give teachers alternative visions of how this might be done. And I'm not talking about painting the ideal classroom. I think actually painting the ideal classroom is problematic because I'm going to throw my hands up as a teacher. I can't do that. I need the steps in between. I need what's the progressions from where I am right now and this master teacher that everybody is showing the video of. Well, help me progress step by step rather than showing the ideal and expecting me to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think I was going to ask about scale next, but I agree with you. I think this job embedded time to collaborate is really key, actually, probably to get at scale. But I'm also just going to touch on some other questions and perhaps we can just weave them together in response to it, Jim. Barbara is asking, how does the distributed leadership model impact on this approach to policy enactment? A model that obviously now props up our whole approach to school self-evaluation and looking at our schools in this context.
It's a great question, Barbara. I think first of all, if in the example from Auburn Park, and I wish I had been able to present some of the data, but you can read the papers. So the paper Change at Scale actually has really detailed accounts about this. But if we took a very narrow notion, what I call place or person-based notions about leadership, and we just focused on the principle in these schools, we would have missed the complexity of leadership practice as it unfolded in these schools, because we would have seen some important things that the principal was doing, but we would have missed the work that coaches and teacher leaders were doing. We would have missed the interactions among teachers and leaders that were fundamental to changing people's thinking about teaching, people's thinking about mathematics, and people's actual practice. We would have missed the importance of the situation, which is really critical when you take a distributed perspective. You cannot understand leadership in these schools without attention to the routines, like the professional learning communities, grade level team meetings, and furthermore, and this is more recent work that I've been doing, I guess I'm still learning, hopefully. We've been pushing beyond the notion that, well, one of my critiques, and this is, I'm critiquing my own work as much as anybody else's, is that much of the work on distributed leadership has focused on one level, in particular the school level. And in recent work, there's a report, a WISE report at the Qatar Foundation on this, a paper with Richard Morel and Azma Al-Fadala, where we argue that for a multi-level distributed perspective on leadership, in other words, that when we look at interactions in schools among teachers and leaders, that in order to understand those interactions, we have to look beyond the school itself to the system. I mean, the interactions that I described, granted briefly here among teachers in Auburn Park, these interactions were fundamentally shaped by artifacts that came from the system level. Mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't just system leaders, or it was system leaders who adopted this curriculum. And by the way, it was not a simple adoption, but the system leaders who made this decision were teachers, representatives from each building. But my point is that we have to think across levels. So in other words, the sort of leadership that we observe in the case of Auburn Park is not only distributed horizontally, it's also distributed vertically. And it's not just about the actors, it's also about the artifacts, such as curriculum, student work, etc. Yeah. I hope, Barbara, I responded adequately to your question.
I mean, some of your response, Jim, and correct me if I'm wrong, it almost talks about the blind spots we can have when we don't take that bigger picture about leadership in the organization. And I wonder then, just Damien Merchant put a question here about educational change projects, and sometimes their failure, he's asking, can come because victory is declared too early and that resources or infrastructure like coaching, professional learning networks, etc., are withdrawn too quickly. And that's the blind spot, isn't it? If you don't have that distributed leadership approach at that system school level that you describe, then maybe that contributes to this issue of making and doing of policy being.
I think Damien's question is right on, Gavin. It speaks to the complexity of scale. You know, when we a common conversation about scale is it's about spread, right? Has everybody adopted the new curriculum? I mean, if we'd gone into Auburn Park and went into all elementary, primary school classrooms in the 14 schools, and we saw the curriculum, we said, oh, in 80% of the classroom, we said, wow, that's a huge spread, right? But as you know, and scale is a way more complex than that. Cynthia Coburn has a wonderful, who's a colleague of mine in Northwestern, has a great article about this, a researcher around 2002, but it's about the depth, right? So are people just, you know, they're using the curriculum, but they're teaching it in the same old way. So the discourse, for example, hasn't changed. It's still put your hand up when you have the right answer, right? That sort of implementation is, there's an issue of depth there. That's what I mean by soul, by the way. The other part is what I refer to, actually, it's a term that another colleague at Northwestern uses, spread and stick. You know, this goes to Damien's point. Let's say we get the depth. Is it maintained across time when all the bells and whistles are gone, when all the professional development is done, right? And Cynthia has one more dimension of scale, which is ownership. And it's not this simplistic notion of getting people to buy in. It's actually, how do you build, okay, we have adopted a new curriculum system-wide in Auburn Park. How do you get a school, a group of primary school teachers to develop a sense that this is our curriculum, that we own this? And I think in part, what's powerful about the infrastructure work that Auburn Park did, and by the way, they did this in one subject, we only focused on one, it is quite likely that the story may not have been the same if we looked at another subject. But what's powerful about that is that they did develop a sense of ownership of the curriculum in the 5 schools we were in, at least. Yes, there were still people who had their doubts. There was one of the schools where I'm not sure this is going to work for our kids being Title I, yeah, kids below the poverty level. And there was some adaptations made. The curriculum was still maintained, but there were some adaptations made. But that's the sort of ownership which I think is important if this is going to be sustained over time, when all the fanfare about the new curriculum disappears.
Yeah. I have a question here from Alan asking around the role of middle tier governance. Again, I suppose a question that touches on trying to implement policy at scale, policy change reform at scale. And he's asking, how important is the role of districts in providing leadership and support in the successful implementation of policy change? I mean, I suppose there are more layers in the onion in the US context than in Ireland, aren't there?
Yeah. So to Alan's question, I mean, if I was, one of the things we've been studying over the last several years are school systems and their efforts to transform themselves into education systems. And if I was doing that work cross-nationally, I would be comparing the national level in Ireland to the US school district. That's one thing to keep in mind. So to me, the middle leadership in a school district in the US are the middle management that sometimes work at the central office, the equivalent of maybe a ministry, although not quite, but often also works in between the system office and the school, or actually some are increasingly school-based. They may be coaches, they may be well, coaches are often, but they also may be like directors of English language arts, mathematics, and their various staff. And I think it is, I actually think, and by the way, there's a lot of work on middle leadership coming out of the UK and has been for some time. But I think it is important, but I think the importance is the extent to which it supports practices that connects not just the various levels, the district with the school, but the different communities of practice that really are fundamental to the work of teaching and learning in a school. So not just teachers and students, but a grade level group, but also groups that cut across grade levels, because after all, even though teaching is pretty much a solo practice, it's really, really important, as we all know who have taught, what happens, what I teach in third grade, well, it'll depend on what was covered in second grade and how it was taught. So there's that kind of alignment also. So I guess my answer is yes, but I think rather than thinking about the level, thinking about how these people connect various groups, various communities of practice that are fundamental to the work.
Okay. Well, Jim, I'm just conscious of the time for everybody else, but also yours, because we've come up to the hour now. I'd like to thank everybody for their questions. There was a few coming in. I tried my best to marshal them all. To thank you very much for your presentation and the question and answers, both with the audience and myself. And to wish you a good day in Florida. And to the audience, have a lovely evening, and we hope to see you on the next series in the webinar too. Professor
That's
Jim,
great.
thanks very much.
Thank you all. It was great to see everybody. Bye-bye.